What's the outlook at quarterback for Oregon Ducks football as they eye the start of spring practice next week? That's our focus on today's episode of the Ducks Dish podcast. And we're back like we never left. Oregon fans, how we living? How's everybody doing? Thanks so much for tuning in to another episode of the Ducks Dish podcast. Just in case you're new here, I'm your host, Max Torres. Do me a quick favor, just take a second out of your day before we get into today's episode. Smash that like and subscribe button. We are here on YouTube at Oregon Football Max Torres. Really appreciate you guys taking some time out of your day to tune in and talk some Duck football with me as we are getting so close. We are 1 week away from the start of spring practice in Eugene, so it's going to be an exciting time. Feels like a long time since we last got some Duck football. Got a little taste of it with the combine, right? And then you have the draft in April, but haven't had the Ducks practicing for quite some time. Last little reminder, leave me a comment or ask a question on the channel here. I'm going to do my best to try to interact with you guys and get some of your questions integrated into future shows. But I'm starting a little bit of a mini series here, if you want to call it that, on the Ducks Dish podcast, where I take a closer look and preview each position group on the Oregon football team heading into the start of spring practice. So some of these episodes might be a little bit shorter here and there, but don't you worry, I'm going to do my very best to make sure that it is still worth a listen for you guys. Want to make sure I'm putting quality content and quality content only out here on YouTube and on the podcast for your listening pleasure. So here we are. We're going to be starting our preview looking at the quarterback position, because why wouldn't you start with the quarterback position? It's the most important position on the field, and honestly, it's kind of been a hit and miss position for Oregon in recent years, right? Looking more recently, last 4 or 5 years, if you want to kind of dial it back then when Oregon was really doing well with Justin Herbert, he was a stud and obviously clearly underutilized given how well he's performing in the NFL. Then you had Tyler Shuck in that 2020 COVID shortened season. He hit the portal and went to Texas Tech. And then Anthony Brown, the Boston College transfer, takes over in 2021. And then Bo Nix comes over in the out of the transfer portal for the 2022 season. So that's kind of just a brief summary in case you guys haven't been watching Oregon football, or you just need to be caught up real quick. But as we kind of break this down a little bit, I think that Bo Nix is obviously the headline of the group, right? He's the star of the team. A lot of people would probably say that he's the team's best player, certainly the best player on offense. And let's just look at how he did in 2022, right? Looking at some of the numbers, you have some of his passing stats here. I have on my other screen, 294 of 409. That is 71.9% completion percentage, 3,593 passing yards for 29 passing touchdowns against just 7 interceptions. And then obviously the big part of Bo Nix's game is that he can hurt you with his legs too. He's a true dual threat quarterback, 89 carries for 510 yards and 14 touchdowns on the ground. And heck, he even threw a receiving touchdown in there for the fun of it. That came against Colorado. I want to say that was in October, maybe early November. I can't quite remember, but he did have that receiving touchdown from Bucky Irving in that game against Colorado. And just to dig a little bit deeper into Bo Nix's numbers, I think I'm going to rewind it a little bit. Now that we know how he actually did at Oregon, let's kind of just take ourselves back to when Bo Nix committed to Oregon. I was writing the story a little bit ago, and I want to say it was December 19th, 2021. I remember I was driving from Eugene with my roommate, Breck. So Breck, if you're listening to this, quick shout out. He was driving me to Portland to catch a flight home for the Christmas holiday season, and Bo Nix committed. I'm not even kidding, the second that we got into the car leaving my house from Eugene. So, that's just a reality of being in the sports journalism business, sports journalism industry, is that news can break at any time and you got to be ready to cover it. So I flipped my hotspot on and, broke my laptop out and I wrote the story. But it was wild because it was, pretty unexpected. But at the same time, I think in the era of the transfer portal and the coaching carousel, you see a lot of these reunions of coaches and quarterbacks or coaches and other players when they move to a new spot, going from one school to the next. Kenny Dillingham, obviously the offensive coordinator under Dan Lanning in his first year at Oregon. We all know that Dillingham was only at Oregon for 1 year, and he has since taken the head coaching job at Arizona State out there in Tempe in his home state of Arizona. But when Bo Nix committed, it was, I feel like, just from kind of reading responses and kind of gauging social media, talking to some Duck fans that I know here and there, it felt like it was kind of a mixed bag. It was good that you got an experienced guy, someone who came from the SEC, where you play against the best defenses in college football. That's the gold standard of college football. I don't want to prop the SEC up too much, but that is where the best football is played more often than not on a year-to-year basis. So you have a quarterback that has experience going against some really, really talented defenses, got his first win against the Ducks. That was kind of another bonus storyline. But the thing with Nix is you'd get these amazing plays from him one drive, and then the next drive he could try to be improvising and try to do too much with the ball, and then he would turn it over. So I think that every Oregon fan probably knew that he had a bunch of big play potential, a bunch of big play upside as a quarterback, but taking care of the ball really wasn't a strength of his, which is why his 2022 season was remarkable. I was going through some of those numbers. In Bo Nix's lone season with the Oregon Ducks, one of his achievements that went under the radar, this guy set the Oregon single season record for completion percentage. He's the first quarterback in Oregon program history, first starting Oregon quarterback in program history to ever post a completion percentage of 70 or higher at 71.9. So you have a guy that you took from Auburn from the transfer portal. You were worried about turnovers, and he threw 29 touchdowns and just 7 interceptions. And I think another note that makes those numbers even more impressive for Bo Nix, a lot of those interceptions came in the earlier part of the season. He had an interception against Georgia, and then, some growing pains earlier on in the regular season, but he really did, for the most part, just get better as the year went on. He, became smarter with his decision-making. He wasn't trying to force passes. I know I was thinking about this when I was looking through the rushing numbers. Someone can correct me if I'm wrong. Maybe there was one here or there, but I want to say that he didn't fumble the ball. And for a quarterback that had darn near 90 carries, for him to have 14 touchdowns and not fumble it, that's pretty amazing. So Bo Nix just came to Oregon and he looked like a completely different quarterback. He revitalized his career under Kenny Dillingham. He went from somebody who was, I think laughingstock is too aggressive of a word to say, but he was not viewed as one of the better quarterbacks in the SEC while he was at Auburn, I think. So he relocates to the West Coast, Western Oregon in Eugene, and just kind of does his thing, and he settles right in, and he really grew a tremendous amount as a quarterback. So he took care of the ball, and he learned from early season miscues. Those were some of the biggest marks of what embodied Bo Nix's success while he was at Oregon in 2022. And he's coming back in 2023, and he's only looking to improve upon those marks, to improve upon what he was able to do in the 2022 season. And another thing that I look at when I look at Bo Nix's improvement, when I look at his body of work during the 2022 season, I thought he got a healthy balance of taking what the defense gave him and then taking risk. Because you could argue that he was taking too many risks before he got to Oregon, but maybe Kenny Dillingham was the QB whisperer, or maybe Bo Nix really just needed a change of scenery. Maybe the Pac-12 defenses really are just that much worse than the SEC. I think it's a combination of everything. But that's still a really good development that you saw from Bo Nix, that he was able to look like a guy who spent 3 years in the SEC, look like a veteran quarterback, look like a guy who had played a lot of football and was capable of making really smart decisions with the football. So I thought that was huge. That healthy balance of taking what the defense gives him. We don't have to take the top off the defense, go for the deep ball all the time. Maybe it makes sense to take the check down here and there when we need to. I think before Bo Nix got to Oregon and the Mario Cristobal, Joe Moorhead, let's be honest, the Mario Cristobal offense with Anthony Brown, everyone was kind of saying that there were too many checkdowns, but that definitely wasn't the case with Oregon and Bo Nix last year. He had the agility and mobility to improvise in the pocket a little bit, buy himself some time. But hey, if something still wasn't there, then you could, check it down. So I thought that was awesome. And then another important point with Bo Nix's game, for a guy who runs as much as Bo Nix does, he's not taking a lot of unnecessary hits. Granted, he did take that big hit against Washington, which was a huge bummer. We all know how that game ended, how that game unfolded. I'm not sure if that was the best play call, running your quarterback up the middle with that really, really long drive. You guys can let me know what you thought about that play call from Kenny Dillingham in that game against Washington. But really, aside from that, he's a guy who was, physical enough. He's a warrior. He's a guy who's going to battle for everything he gets, but he's not unnecessarily putting himself in harm's way, which is really important because to a degree, the quarterback situation, and I'll talk about this a little bit more later on in this episode when I talk about some of the other passers in the room, the depth last year compared to this year is not all of that different if we're strictly looking at a scholarship quarterback situation. And the point I'm kind of trying to get at there is that there's not a whole lot of proven depth in this quarterback room. There wasn't last year, and I think you can make the argument that there really isn't that much this year. So what am I saying when I say that? Bo Nix is basically, what this team has. When Bo Nix got hurt and Ty Thompson had to come in, things didn't go how Oregon wanted them to. Granted, that's a really brutal time to come into a game for Ty Thompson, but we'll talk a little bit more about him later. So the point there is that you're not taking unnecessary hits. You want a guy who's going to be physical, who's going to, go to war for you and try to get all the yards you can, but you don't want him being reckless. That's basically what I'm saying when you're just talking about managing a dual threat quarterback. And another big storyline around the quarterback position, and with Bo Nix and Eugene, this is the first time that Oregon has had continuity at the quarterback position with their starter from one season to the next. It really feels like it wasn't that long ago, but Oregon hasn't had a starting quarterback return for them to start another year since Justin Herbert between the 2018 and the 2019 seasons. Because remember, I said after Herbert, it was Tyler Shuck. After Tyler Shuck, it was Anthony Brown. After Anthony Brown, it was Bo Nix. And now after Bo Nix, it's more Bo Nix. And what a colossal recruiting win that was for Dan Linney and the Oregon Ducks to get him back to Eugene, especially after Kenny Dillingham's departure following that loss to Oregon State. That was kind of the biggest question that Duck fans were asking. What does this mean for Bo Nix? Is he going to come back to play for another year? But you have continuity. There's a new offensive coordinator coming in, but largely, you have continuity at the most important position on the field. And with the era of the transfer portal, quarterback, and this is a huge discussion that we can't probably just wrap up in this one episode. The quarterback position isn't necessarily one that you have to, I think you have to recruit for the future and, try to keep your roster just stacked with talent. But you can go to the portal and get a guy for 1 year and he can, make you super, super competitive. I mean, that was basically what Oregon, and since we're talking Pac-12, what Washington did last year with Michael Penix. Both of those guys could have gone to the NFL, but they both came back for another year. So this is where you're getting that extra COVID year really helping Oregon. So I can't overestimate how much of a bonus I really think it is that Bo Nix is coming back for another year and that Oregon has continuity at quarterback. That is going to be absolutely huge. But just because Bo Nix is coming back doesn't mean that erases all doubt, that erases all questions at the position, because now a big question that people are asking themselves is, can Bo Nix replicate his 2022 season under Will Stein? Can he, or did Kenny Dillingham capture lightning in a bottle? And it's going to be hard to replicate that in 2023, excuse me. I think that there's a lot of reason to be optimistic about Will Stein and what he brings to the table as an offensive coordinator, as a quarterback's coach. You look at the numbers when he was at UTSA, they were, top 25, I want to say, in most offensive statistical categories. He's a young guy, so a lot of people not innovate, sorry. A lot of people associate youth with being a guy who's going to recruit, youth being a guy who's going to be innovative and creative on offense, who's going to adapt to where the game is going. And I think that those are all things that you could probably see Will Stein doing. I think that it's a little bit of a bummer that you have to have another new coordinator, because obviously if you were asking Dan Lanning right now, hey, you want to lose your offensive coordinator? I'm pretty sure he wouldn't say, yeah, I want to lose my offensive coordinator. But I'm saying all that to say I feel like Will Stein is a guy who's going to be smart enough to go into these meetings, to come to Oregon and say, hey, this worked under Dillingham. Let's try to keep that going. And then, hey, here's a tweak or two that I want to bring to the table from what I thought worked well for me at UTSA and what I think can be beneficial for us here at Oregon, given the personnel, given the opponent, what have you. So that's a big question. Can Bo Nix do it again in 2023? And there's a reason there's reasons in addition to Will Stein why I think that he can do that. You have a really good offensive line, at least in terms of the personnel, the pieces that are there. You lose Big Sala, you lose Forsyth, you lose Bass, you lose Walk. So that's a lot of guys. That's 4 out of your 5 offensive linemen right there. But you still have Stephen Jones, who missed most of last year. He was a starter before he got hurt against Georgia. You still have Marcus Harper II, who was a stud, who came in to support, came in place of Stephen Jones. You have Jackson Powers Johnson, who's been awesome since he got to Oregon. You have Josh Connerly Jr., who comes back from last year's team. And then you lose Adrian Clem at that offensive line spot. That's a pretty significant loss for Oregon. We can talk more about that when we preview the O-line. But before Adrian Clem headed to the NFL, he went out and got 2 of the top offensive linemen in the transfer portal in Ajani Cornelius, the tackle from Rhode Island, and Junior Angelau, who projects as a guard from Texas. So those are plug-and-play guys is what you would think. So to get Bo Nix to come back, you knew there had to be, a plan there. Hey, I want to make sure I'm getting some protection. And I think that he's going to have another great offensive line under Alik Terry, Mike Kavanaugh, and the rest of that offensive line staff. You have arguably the best backfield, the best stable of running backs in the country, certainly in the Pac-12. But I think that there's an argument to be made for Oregon having the best running backs in the country. You have good skill talent, Troy Franklin, Tez Johnson, Bo Nix's adopted brother. They obviously have a good chemistry from their time playing in Pinson, Alabama before Tez went to Troy and Bo went to Auburn and then ended up at Oregon. And then you also have Chris Hudson, Trayshawn Holden, Kyler Casper. There's more guys there. Justice Lowe, an in-state guy from Lake Oswego. So there's some good pieces there. And then you also have Terrence Ferguson, Patrick Herbert, Kenyon Sadiq at tight end. I think you want to add some more pieces there, but there's good talent there for Bo Nix to work with. So that's the situation at quarterback for Bo Nix. Let's talk about some of the other names in the room, although admittedly there's not as much to talk about because they haven't played a whole lot of football. So Ty Thompson. Ty Thompson's the guy that you talk about as the primary backup. And the story with him, we all know it, but we're just going to get everyone up to speed. He's the highest rated quarterback to ever sign with the University of Oregon out of high school. Just to kind of sum up the career that he's had at Oregon since signing with Oregon in 2021. So he's played 2 seasons at Oregon, played very sparingly, but has served as the primary backup to Anthony Brown and then Bo Nix last year. But he comes in and the results are pretty much the same each time, right? He looks like he's not super comfortable. The offense gets a little bit choppy. It's not flowing the way that it used to, or that you would like it to. I don't even think he attempted a pass in that game against Washington when he came in. So I thought that was pretty surprising. They kind of feels like the staff kind of took the ball out of his hands in that game, but you can comment yourself what you thought there. But there's a lot of other factors that I think are at play here with Ty Thompson. The guy's had 3 different offensive coordinators. Started with Joe Moorhead, then he got Kenny Dillingham, and now he has Will Stein. I think that it's tough when you have a young quarterback who's trying to adjust to the college game. He should probably be adjusted by now after 2 seasons in college, but he's trying to kind of find his way, find his role at Oregon and take that next step in his development. But you keep changing up the scheme, you keep changing up the coach. That's going to come with some challenges, right? And then there's some other things too. He's not being put in at the best times. Obviously, that game against Washington is a prime example. And then what I also mean by that is that he's getting put in at the end of games when it's kind of a blowout and you don't have the best personnel in there, right? So he doesn't have the best offensive line, the best skill talent to work with and kind of magnify his talents. But with all that being said, I don't want to be making excuses for Ty. I'm just trying to, lay out the whole context here. We have to make sure we say this. I think it's admirable what he's doing in terms of, being a guy who's going to wait his turn. I think I saw Zach Neal talking about it with Joey Harrington on his podcast. That's where I saw it, and it was a really good point. So I think it bears repeating. Ty Thompson's sticking around. Ty Thompson is biding his time, grinding, trying to become better, facing the adversity that comes with all these coaches coming in and out. A transfer coming in to two transfers, if you want to count Anthony Brown as well, right? And then Bo Nix coming in last year, and he's still sticking around. So the question right now is, can he be a reliable backup that the team needs him to be? If Bo Nix gets hurt or needs to miss any amount of time, this team needs to be confident that Ty Thompson can get them where they need to go and take care of business. So I think that it's admirable that he's waiting for his turn. Right now, I think you go through the 2023 season. Like I said, you want him to be your primary backup. And then heading into 2024 in spring football, you want to be confident that Ty Thompson's going to be able to compete for the starting job, because this could be Ty Thompson could be the most physically gifted quarterback that Oregon has ever had. I mean, the dude is just off the charts, got a cannon of an arm. We know that he can run. It's just a matter of putting it all together. But there's also some people out there that, maybe ask, hey, if after this third season, if he can't put it together, is it going to happen at Oregon, or does it make sense to go to another spot? I'm rooting for Ty Thompson. I covered him a ton when he was getting recruited to Oregon, and he's a great kid. So I definitely want to see him have some success at Oregon. And then there's one more scholarship quarterback that we have to talk about, and that is Austin Novosad, the 2023 Oregon quarterback signee from Dripping Springs, Texas. This was an interesting story because I remember he'd been committed to Baylor for a really long time. And before Oregon even got in the picture, you had Ohio State, Notre Dame, I want to say Texas A&M. You had some really big schools that were coming after Austin Novosad, trying to shake up his recruitment, trying to get him to budge, and he wouldn't do it. But then December comes around, Kenny Dillingham leaves, Dante Moore flips from Oregon to UCLA, the 5-star quarterback, and then SI All-American had him as the number 1 overall recruit in the country. He flips to UCLA, and then Will Stein gets hired and just signs Austin Novosad like it was nothing. So there you see the Texas pipeline and the Texas connections really paying dividends for Oregon. Just a couple notes on Novosad. I went to see him at the Adidas All-American Bowl out in San Antonio in early January, late December. And I think that watching him play against some of those elite guys, he's a smooth guy at quarterback. I do like his throwing motion, but he maybe doesn't have the best mechanics from kind of some of what I've seen other people say. And I think I can kind of validate that from seeing him in person. He's not a major dual threat guy. He's a guy that's going to be able to improvise, but I don't think he's going to be running a lot of read options. But there's one thing that's really good that absolutely stood out about Austin Novosad at the All-American Bowl. This dude can throw it deep. He's got a really good deep ball. He was in a groove with a bunch of different receivers during practices. I think that you can't really take the sample size of the game, with too much. You have to take it with a grain of salt because the East just absolutely overpowered the West along the line of scrimmage, whether that's the West's offensive line or the West's defensive line. If you watch that game, it was a blowout, and Austin Novosad was playing for the West. So I'm not trying to give them excuses, but I mean, they just were totally outmatched. The West was. Last thing on Austin Novosad, when I talked to him and, learned about his decision, he was saying that, he wanted to go to Oregon in part because he had an opportunity to learn behind Bo Nix, to wait behind Bo Nix. You want to learn from a guy. If you have to wait, if you have to learn from everybody, you want to learn from someone going to the NFL. And that's the opportunity that Bo Nix kind of presents with Austin Novosad. He's a young guy. Oregon's going to need him to develop really in a hurry, not to play this year, but once Bo Nix leaves, it's kind of back to square one, depending on what they do in 2024 on the recruiting trail, and depending on how Ty Thompson looks this year, depending on how Austin Novosad looks this year in his development at Oregon. There are a trio of preferred walk-ons that the Ducks are going to have in 2023. That's Marcus Sanders from the 2022 class. That's Missouri State transferred Jake Van Dyne. And then local quarterback out of Sheldon, Brock Thomas. I don't think he's enrolled just yet, but I'm not totally sure. But I did want to make sure to mention him because those are some of the other names in the quarterback room for Oregon. So the long and short of it, Oregon has an absolute stud, has a star quarterback in Bo Nix, but behind him, it's pretty up in the air. It's pretty big question mark for Oregon. So I hope we get to see Ty Thompson, maybe even Austin Novosad at some point. And I hope it's not out of necessity. I hope it's just because Oregon's winning games and they're putting themselves in good positions to get some of these younger guys involved. So that'll do it for this episode of the Ducks Dish podcast, looking at the quarterback position. Do me a favor and hit the like and subscribe button and share the Ducks Dish podcast with your friends, with your family, with other Duck fans. Important to lock in with me on all social media platforms. You can follow me on Twitter and Instagram at Torres Sports. That's the quickest way to get my updates on Oregon football and Oregon football recruiting. That'll do it for today's episode. Appreciate you guys tuning in, however you're tuned in, wherever you're tuned in. Thanks so much for taking some time out of your day to talk some Duck football with me, and we'll catch you in the next episode of the Ducks Dish podcast.